Hello and welcome to this launch event for energy security in the Nordics. Welcome to all of you. We're very excited to get this report out. We have got a quite exciting program for you today. We are going to hear from the team from Economic Security Forum who have made this exciting report. They're represented here with Antti Rauhala and Michael Miguel. So that will be very interesting. We have also a keynote from our General Secretary of the Nordic Council of Ministers, Karen Elleman. So thank you to her for also being here to address this important topic. And my name is Ola Ødegaard. I'm a senior advisor at Nordic Energy Research, and I will be moderating this event. For your information, you are welcome to write questions into the chat or the Q&A section of the meeting, and we will go through them after the presentations. So just please write whatever questions you have as we go along. I think we all just want to get started and hear about some of the results in this mapping report. So without further ado, I will give the word to our General Secretary, Karen Elleman. Thank you, Karen, for coming here, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Ole, and hi everybody here on the screen. I hope you hear me loud and clear. I'm in Copenhagen, and well, thank you for also giving me this opportunity to actually address you all and say welcome to this important report launch here at Nordic Energy Research. Back in October last year, the Nordic energy ministers, they emphasized in a joint statement the need for intensified Nordic cooperation to strengthen energy security and emergency preparedness. And against this backdrop, Nordic Energy Research has commissioned Economic Security Forum to map energy security in the Nordic region. And that's what you have in front of you now, because the report Energy Security in the Nordics covers vulnerabilities in the Nordic energy system, but also opportunities in Nordic cooperation for the future in short and long-term perspectives, and also the state of Nordic energy security. It's not a given thing, I believe, that we can just deliver such an important report with important findings and recommendations. But we can so in our Nordic region, and we can so because the Nordic Energy Cooperation is one of the world's most successful regional energy partnerships. And that's because we, for decades, have been guided by trust and shared ambitions and also cross-border cooperation. And we have delivered clean, reliable, and affordable electricity. And this integrated system has, of course, become a cornerstone of Nordic competitiveness and prosperity. But of course, today's security environment is fundamentally different from the one in which our cooperation was built. And that's why our energy security cooperation is extremely important right now, because the war in Ukraine has really shown us that energy infrastructure is no longer just an economic asset. It can be and is a strategic target. Attacks on power plants, on cables, transformers, that really brings the realities of war into people's homes, leaving families without heat, without electricity, and access to essential services. And while we here in the Nordics, thankfully, are not facing such circumstances, I think the lessons are very clear. Modern societies are highly dependent on secure and reliable energy supplies. And at its most fundamental level, energy security is about ensuring access to electricity, heating, and fuel, especially when a crisis occurs. And that's why we also have to be honest and say that the Nordic region now, we operate in a new risk landscape. Geopolitical tensions are increasing across Europe and globally, and energy infrastructure faces growing threats from cyber attacks, from sabotage, hybrid warfare, but also climate crisis, such as extreme weather, and also structural dependencies. So our energy transition can no longer be viewed only as a market or climate issue, but it is also a security and resilience issue. The positive note, if I should try to bring that in, is, of course, that we actually have done this before. Taking us all back to the 1970s, the oil crisis really transformed Nordic energy policy, and organizations such as Nordic Energy Research were created to actually platform Nordic Energy Cooperation. The Nordics, through joint efforts and market integration, really accelerated the shift away from fossil fuels and strengthened decarbonization efforts. And our high level of renewable energy deployment has made this region more energy secure than any other part of Europe. And as a result of all these efforts, the Nordic region is better positioned today than many other parts of the world. And I think that's important to find our energy in the work from that specific experiences and that specific cooperation that we do have. And of course, also saying that being prepared does not mean being immune to future crises. And this is why, after the Nordic energy ministers in October, we at the Nordic Council of Ministers and with, of course, Nordic Energy Research, we commissioned Economic Security Forum to map the Nordic energy system's vulnerabilities so that we can have the best possible foundation to jointly build a more robust and resilient Nordic region, a region where we are better prepared for future crises and where we are able to shield ourselves from external shocks and increase the security, of course, for our citizens. So what you're looking into now is that we will receive the recommendations and the analysis, and then, of course, a lot of work goes on from there, because then start to figure out what the next steps are for the Nordic Energy Cooperation. And some of the questions that really needs answers ahead are, where does our cooperation need to be developed? What steps can the Nordic cooperation make to actually increase our energy security? So with this opening remarks from my side, I will, of course, now leave the mics to the real interesting people to listen to, because you will now give us the deep dive into the findings of this report. So stay tuned, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to address you all. I wish you a fruitful day.
Thank you so much, Karen Ellemann, and thank you for highlighting some of the reasons why we are actually doing this and why it's so important for the Nordic cooperation on energy security. So thank you. With that, I think we will turn the cameras to Antti and Mikael from Economic Security Forum, and the floor is yours. And please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for those remarks. There's a bit of an echo for some reason on my end. I wonder if we can get rid of that echo or not. If not, I'll just go on. And I hope you can see me as well. I can't see myself for some reason. But I guess the camera is on. What I would like to do in the next few minutes is really to set out the report's central argument. Why Nordic energy security looks different today than it did just a few years ago, and what that means for Nordic cooperation. My colleague Antti Rauhala will then take you through the detailed analysis and recommendations. I want to begin with what the Nordic region has actually achieved, because this is really not a report about failure. In many respects, the Nordic energy system is one of the most successful in the world. The concept at the center of this slide is the energy trilemma. That is the challenge of simultaneously ensuring security, affordability, and sustainability. Most countries struggle to advance all three at the same time, so that progress in one area often comes at the expense of another. What is remarkable about the Nordic region is that it has largely managed to advance all three simultaneously. On security, around 90% of Nordic electricity generation comes from hydro, wind, nuclear, and geothermal energy. That's a remarkably broad energy mix. Norwegian and Swedish hydropower reservoirs provide roughly 140 terawatt hours of storage capacity, which give us a regional buffer that no other European sub-region can actually match. No single disruption affects all these sources simultaneously, which really provides for good energy security. On affordability, hydro and nuclear power provide us with electricity at very low marginal cost, and this structural advantage helped shield Nordic consumers from the worst of the price spikes experienced elsewhere in Europe during the energy crisis, let's say, of 2021 to 2023. Finally, on sustainability, the Nordic countries are well ahead of most European peers. Denmark generates more than 80% of its electricity from wind and solar. Finland has set a carbon neutrality target for 2035. Norway's power sector is already overwhelmingly renewable. Iceland runs almost entirely on geothermal and hydropower. And these are real achievements, and they are the reason the Nordic region is often seen internationally as a model for balancing the competing objectives of energy policy. Yet the purpose of this report is not simply to celebrate these achievements, it's also to ask whether the structures that help deliver them are still fit for today's security environment. And that brings us to the central challenge in the report. The geopolitical shift since 2022 is making this balance harder to maintain, and it's specifically cooperation gaps that are increasingly becoming the principal vulnerability. So the energy trilemma has been broadly balanced in the Nordics, but the conditions under which it was balanced have changed, and the cooperation frameworks have clearly not fully adapted. So what has changed? The left side of this slide describes the world in which much of the Nordic cooperation architecture was originally designed. A world of market disruptions, natural disasters, bilateral agreements between trusted partners, and energy security primarily understood as a national responsibility. Now, the right side here then describes the environment that the energy architecture now faces. We've seen deliberate attacks on critical infrastructure, geopolitical price transmission across integrated markets, and a profound transformation on demand of demand, driven by electrification, industrial transition, and the rapid growth of data centers. 3 events since 2022 have exposed this mismatch very clearly, let's say. First of all, Russia's invasion of Ukraine demonstrated that Nordic electricity prices can track continental gas indexed prices regardless of the Nordic generation mix. So regardless of us not actually using much gas, electricity prices are affected anyhow. The sequence of Baltic Sea incidents from Nord Stream to Baltic Connector and Estlink 2 have all showed that critical energy infrastructure is now an active target rather than only a hypothetical vulnerability. And the Strait of Hormuz crisis this year demonstrated that even a region as structurally buffered as the Nordic one remains exposed to global energy shocks through international markets. Nordic diesel prices increased within days despite no direct disruption to Nordic supply. So all 3 events point to a very different context from what our energy system has been designed for, and especially our cooperation frameworks. Our core finding is the following. Political commitment to cooperation has now advanced faster than the operational mechanisms needed to deliver it. So the political declarations have largely been right. The challenge is that the institutional machinery needed to turn those ambitions into coordinated action has not kept pace. And that gap between ambition and operational capability is the central theme of this report. One of the things that became very clear during this project is that Nordic energy security is really taking place in 2 quite different strategic theaters. The first is the Baltic Sea. Here the challenge is clustering. The Baltic contains one of the world's densest concentration of cross-border energy and communications infrastructure. This means that electricity cables, gas pipelines, data cables, offshore wind connections, and interconnectors are increasingly concentrated within a relatively small geographic space. And the consequence is that a single incident can affect multiple systems simultaneously. So for instance, the Estlink 2 incident last December was not simply an isolated event. It was part of a broader pattern that has revealed the growing vulnerability of densely interconnected infrastructure. And this challenge is likely to grow. Offshore wind capacity in the Baltic is expected to expand quite dramatically over the coming decades, which brings with it a corresponding increase in the number of critical offshore assets that need to be protected. The second theater is the Arctic and the Norwegian Sea. And here the challenge is distance. Response times are measured not in hours, but often in days. Infrastructure here is dispersed across vast geographical areas, and weather conditions are more demanding. Detection and repair are significantly more complicated as a result. The clearest example is the Hammerfest LNG facility at Melkøya. It represents the only export route for gas from the Norwegian Barents Sea. So when a fire shut the facility down in 2020, it remained offline for 21 months, and there was no alternative export route available. In other words, if Hammerfest stops, Barents Sea gas exports stop. And connecting these two theaters is the Russian shadow fleet, the same category of vessel associated with recent Baltic infrastructure incidents operates across Arctic waters as well. The governance and enforcement challenges the governance and enforcement challenges that make these vessels difficult to monitor and deter apply in both regions. That is, so the key point here is that the Baltic and Arctic present fundamentally different vulnerability profiles, and they therefore require different preparedness and cooperation models. So what does all of this now mean for Nordic cooperation? The report identifies 5 strategic gaps in current cooperation frameworks, and these are different in nature, but they all point in the same direction. So cooperation certainly exists, but it has not fully adapted to the security environment we face today. So the first gap is the absence of a joint Nordic energy security strategy. Nordic energy ministers have issued increasingly strong joint declarations since 2022, but these declarations are not anchored in a shared strategy that systematically would identify cross-border vulnerabilities, that would align priorities, and that would provide a common analytical foundation for cooperation over time. The second gap is that many emergency protocols were designed for an entirely different threat environment. Most existing arrangements were developed to address unintentional disruptions, so storms, technical failures, market disturbances, or isolated outages. They were not designed for deliberate, coordinated, multi-asset attacks on critical infrastructure. Now the threat environment has changed, but the cooperation protocols have not changed to the same degree. The third gap is the absence of a shared threat picture. Energy ministers, they meet regularly, they cooperate extensively, they issue joint statements, and they pursue many common initiatives. But they do so without a standing joint threat assessment or a shared analytical product that systematically would examine how risks are evolving across the region. There is no common baseline for understanding how national energy security decisions affect neighboring countries. So in many respects, ministers are being asked to cooperate on something they have never jointly analyzed. The fourth gap concerns infrastructure planning. The primary mechanisms used to prioritize infrastructure investment focus on economic criteria: congestion reduction, market efficiency, and renewable integration. And these are, of course, no doubt very important objectives. But sabotage, resistance, redundancy, repairability, and security of supply considerations are not yet primary planning criteria. There is therefore a gap between declaring infrastructure protection a priority and the mechanisms that actually determine which infrastructure gets built. The fifth and final gap concerns regional balance. The Baltic region now benefits from a relatively dense and layered cooperation architecture for infrastructure protection and security coordination. The Arctic does not. Yet some of the most consequential single point of failure vulnerabilities are located precisely there in the Arctic. The further from the center, the thinner the cooperation becomes. Taken together, these 5 gaps point to a broader conclusion, which is that the challenge facing the Nordic countries is not necessarily a lack of cooperation. The challenge is that existing cooperation needs to become more operational, more security-oriented, and more systematic. And that is the central argument of the report. Those 5 gaps provide the framework for everything that follows. And I will now hand over to Antti Rauhala, who will take you through how these challenges appear in practice across electricity, gas, fuel security, and critical infrastructure, and what specific measures the report recommends to address them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikael. I hope that you can both see and hear me, because I cannot do either. So, as Mikael laid out, these 5 gaps, these are the strategic frame of our analysis. And what I want to do now is to go from this strategic level to level of energy carriers and then the operational layer to show you what vulnerabilities and the potential for deepen cooperation measures we have identified as part of this project. And before we go to specific energy carriers, I want to spend a moment still on this system level to unpack a couple of the key observations we have made and a couple of the key recommendations in this area. So first, on institutionalizing Nordic level energy security strategy and governance. So one of the most consequential single recommendations we want to put forward is to establish a Nordic energy security strategy, because without an overall strategic document or approach, cooperation remains piecemeal and lacks that system-level framing. And in that way, the strategy acts as a bit of the connective tissue between all of the other recommendations and gaps we have identified. We also suggest that such a strategy would be complemented by a cooperation registry, so that there would be a shared and constantly updated understanding across the region of what mechanisms exist and where gaps remain. And to translate the awareness to technical level engagement, we suggest a cross-sectoral working group that brings together different actors from TSOs to regulators and ministries and cybersecurity agencies around the same table to really have that holistic approach to addressing energy security, because one of the key observations that Mikael laid out is that in energy market integration terms, Nordics are very closely integrated, but then in terms of institutional cooperation, there is still a bit of a gap between that integrated reality and the current state. So then the second group of recommendation focus on situational awareness. As part of the mapping we did for this project, we conducted a survey of Nordic energy officials across the region, and from that survey, information sharing was identified as the highest priority cooperation area with the most short-term potential. So we recommend an annual Nordic joint threat assessment that would include both a public summary and then a classified annex that would pull together the different cross-regional risks, and then also establish a cross-border information sharing protocol. Then the third group of recommendations you see here focuses on physical infrastructure protection. So not to repeat Mikael's analysis of the Baltic and Arctic threat environments, but the point is that effective regional response architecture should include pre-agreed cable repair vessel access, harmonized minimum standards for physical protection of critical infrastructure, and a joint emergency repair framework for addressing the reality of 12 to 18-month lead times on many of these critical components. And the fourth group focuses on cyber and hybrid threats, and also the specific needs of island energy systems. So there is currently in place an informal network of Nordic TSOs, the transmission system operators, chief information security officers who convene informally to exchange on threats, but we recommend that these types of format should be formalized into a operational information sharing mechanism so that it is not just a discussion forum. And considering the specific vulnerabilities that the island energy systems face, we recommend there also be a dedicated assessment of island energy systems vulnerabilities. And these should cover then Iceland, Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Åland. So now if we move to and to the specific energy carriers and starting with electricity. So this is where arguably the Nordic system is at its strongest, but also where the landscape is evolving the fastest. So all even conservative national scenarios project substantial demand growth for electricity. So in Denmark, up to 2.6 times, 2.5 times from current levels up to 2050. And in other major of these so-called continental Nordic countries, the demand growth in the range of 1.5 to 1.7 from current levels. And these are just the conservative estimates. In the more ambitious electrification scenarios, we see substantially even faster growth. And most of the growth comes from the electrification of transport and industry, so not just data centers that have been subject to intense public debate across the Nordic region. And in the so the primary challenge for electricity in the Nordics is not that of inadequacy of supply in the long run. It is more the reality that there is a gap between how fast the demand ramps up and how fast the supply ramps up. So new demand can come online in a year or two, while new transmission lines can take 7 to 8 years to build. And this gap has also been identified by ENSO-E modeling as posing the highest adequacy risk in the early 2030s. And just a couple of words on data centers specifically. So Norway alone has had a queue of 5.4 gigawatts of reserved data center capacity in the connection queue earlier this year, which is more than Finland's entire annual electricity production. And our mapping has identified limited mechanisms currently in place between the Nordic electricity TSOs to inform each other of this compounding demand growth. And this is one of the key governance gaps we have surfaced. So overall, the electricity cooperation architecture is already the most institutionally mature compared to other energy carriers and then rest of Europe. So Nord Pool and the Nordic Regional Coordination Center that brings together the different TSOs are genuinely pioneering in international context. NordBER and bilateral TSO emergency sharing agreements are also in place. And then especially Finland and Sweden have also developed deep bilateral preparedness relationships between their national emergency supply agencies. And that also provides a bit of a template for scaling these to a more multilateral Nordic formats. But a bit like Mikael said, the market mandate is strong, and it is the security mandate where there is more to develop. So the Nordic Regional Cooperation Center of the TSOs is mandated for operational efficiency, so capacity calculations, congestion management, and short-term adequacy forecasting, but less so for threat and response security. So that gap is widening as the overall energy system electrifies further and demand surges become harder to predict. So we have put out 6 recommendations targeting electricity markets specifically, and the most immediately actionable is to establish a shared TSO demand pipeline protocol. So when any connection above, let's say, 50 megawatts is approved in any Nordic country, the relevant TSO notifies all others. And this would increase the visibility of national authorities on demand trajectories regionally in this deeply integrated system. And alongside demand pipeline protocol, we recommend a common adequacy assessment methodology so that Nordic countries are measuring the same thing when they assess whether they have enough capacity, and a coordinated approach to flexibility and capacity mechanisms to avoid creating any cross-border market distortions. And on physical electricity infrastructure, we recommend a joint inventory of those critical components, so transformers, high voltage cables, and with a view of building that kind of a strategic reserve based on existing bilateral cooperation between Finland and Sweden. So then moving on to natural gas, and this is an area where there's a bit of a structural paradox. So Norway is by far Europe's largest supplier of natural gas, supplying 130 billion cubic meters to European markets in 2024. And it makes it on par with the US as Europe's most notable gas supplier if you compare both the pipeline and LNG supply. And around 95% of Norway's gas goes to EU and UK markets on through gas pipelines. But then at the same time, Norway sits outside of EU solidarity framework that affect Norway's customers. Norway's Gasco, so the gas TSO, participates in European framework through the NSOG only as an observer, and then there is no pan-Nordic format bringing together the different gas TSOs like there is for electricity. At the same time, Norway also holds no bilateral gas emergency agreements with any Nordic countries. So the practical implication is that if Norwegian gas infrastructure gets disrupted, whether it's through equipment failures or industrial action or then hostile hybrid or military action, there is no pre-agreed procedure for how Norway then communicates the information regarding those disruptions to other Nordic gas authorities, nor what information is shared or on what timelines. So we put forward 2 recommendations in this area, and the first is that we recommend there to be a bilateral emergency sharing agreement between Norway and Denmark, and then between Norway and Finland that are still notable gas users in the Nordic context, and also a multilateral pan-Nordic gas TSO forum. In the medium term, we suggest that this type of a gas cooperation would also then pave the way for hydrogen in the future if hydrogen infrastructure scales and plays a bigger role in the Nordic energy mixes, because the lesson from natural gas would be that it's better to put these arrangements in place upfront rather than wait for some kind of a crisis scenario to happen first and then retrofit the frameworks with those emergency arrangements after. So then we move to fuel security, and the reality is that despite Nordics making significant headway in the energy transition, oil still covers 29% of Nordic total final energy consumption, and at the same time, Nordic refining capacity has fallen 16% since 2021 alone, which creates vulnerabilities, if not on the overall level, at least in the level of specific fuels, most notably jet fuel. So the jet fuel import dependency in the Nordics stands at 68%, and also in terms of emergency reserves that the different countries hold, Norway holds only 20 days reserves, which dates back to a decision made in early 2000s when the threat environment looked quite different. And the basic point, if you look at regarding jet fuel, is that while the overall dependency on fuels on oil might not be that high, but then in these specific fuel categories, there is much more, the threat picture looks quite different. And you can also see that there's a regional divergence across the Nordics, with the island energy systems, especially Faroe Islands and Greenland, being far more exposed to fuel-related disruptions than rest of the Nordics. And also these systems do not have any pipeline supply alternatives, so rely on quite the combination of quite limited emergency reserves and then on maritime imports alone. And then the chart on the right shows the import dependency by different fuel products. And the most acute point as highlighted is jet fuel. So Sweden and Denmark both import around 100% of their jet fuel that they use. Iceland similarly, and Finland is the only one where the picture is more positive, with import dependency of only 27% because of higher domestic refining capacity. And a bit like natural gas, there is no Nordic coordination mechanisms for these specific products, even if they underpin both civilian aviation and then defense logistics simultaneously. So we recommend 3 actions focused on fuel security specifically. So first is a harmonized Nordic emergency demand management protocol that would cover both the rationing, so the demand side under any crisis situation, and then include also specific provisions for island energy systems. And these should also extend beyond fuels to also other forms of energy, from electricity to natural gas. So then the second recommendation focuses on private sector fuel security guidelines to develop shared frameworks that would cover aviation, maritime freight, fishing, and then cold chain logistics. And then specifically on jet fuel, we recommend there to be a standing forum that would include the national emergency supply agencies and civilian aviation authorities meeting at least twice a year to conduct joint assessments of sector-specific reserve arrangements and any emergency storage to hedge against any wider scale disruption. We also develop, finally, country-specific recommendations as part of the report, and the idea here is not to go through country by country, but just to highlight the overall logic. So the principle that we have taken to these recommendations is to surface priorities that do not always emerge on the regional level discussions. And the challenges we have identified, in our view, matter specifically for how each Nordic country's energy system interacts with the wider Nordic architecture. So to highlight a couple examples, first, the Bornholm energy island under development in Denmark, which is to be a major hub for both offshore wind development and then interconnectors between mainland Europe and then the Nordic markets. And this creates, as any island systems have often single points of failure in these cross-border connections. And we recommend that the design of this infrastructure takes this security by design approach already from the start, and also ensures that there is multilateral view on the effects that these infrastructure constellations and whatever, and the different threat scenarios associated with them, that what they have for the future Nordic level regional energy system. And then second, a bit on that Arctic context, and specifically Norway's northern Finnmark bottleneck, that illustrates also the mismatch between how the energy infrastructure has been developed on the civilian side and then on the military side implications that has. So in the far north of Norway, there has been a single transmission ring with limited redundancy, serving significant both energy and military infrastructure. So the Banak Air Base, the Melkoja gas processing infrastructure that Mikael highlighted, and many other Arctic defense installations. So there's been ongoing works to upgrade these connections to build in both higher capacity and redundancy, but these works have been delayed by some years. And that highlights the case where upgrades to civilian energy infrastructure has been lagging the buildup of the military side as the overall threat environment has changed. So just to summarize, so the Nordic energy system is not underprepared because of lack of any political will. There has been many significant joint declarations, especially since 2022, since when the threat environment has become more exposed and intense. And the core problem is that that political will has not yet really been fully converted into that operational reality. And by that we mean shared protocols that activate without requiring political level decision making at the moment of crisis, to ensuring that there are interoperable systems that are built in peacetime so that they also work under crisis situations, and then material reserves of critical equipment, cables, transformers, and then fuel stocks that can be deployed not just nationally but across borders at a time of crisis. So addressing this holistic view of energy security, the roadmap puts 25 recommendations addressing the system level, different energy carriers, and then the national energy systems. But with that, I'll wrap up and hand it back to Ole. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antti and Mikael. Thank you for that fantastic presentation of the report. I think we will move straight into a Q&A. And I can see that there are already some questions in the chat, so we can start with them. We can start with Karen Marie Sandgren, who has asked, you mentioned political will to cooperate, but there are very different political governmental perceptions across the Nordic countries on the value and benefit of interconnected grids and markets. Also, some Nordic countries are intent on finding and implementing solutions to conflicting critical interests between, for instance, wind power and defense offshore, while other countries are less keen to remove barriers to synergies and coexistence between these critical interest areas. Do you consider this an issue for regional energy security?
So I can perhaps start by responding to that. I would actually distinguish between two levels. At one level, different national priorities and political preferences are entirely natural. The countries have different energy mixes, different geographies, different security considerations. We should not expect complete alignment on every issue, of course. The more important question is, or the more important question for regional energy security is whether those differences are understood, analyzed, and managed collectively. And our report's concern is not that countries make different choices, but that there is no common framework for assessing how those choices affect the resilience of the wider Nordic system. The offshore wind and defense example is a good illustration. Different countries may strike different balances, but because infrastructure, electricity markets, and security risks are increasingly interconnected, those decisions have regional implications. So that is precisely why we argue for a stronger shared threat picture and a more systematic strategic coordination. So yes, different national priorities are part of the challenge, but they are also exactly why stronger Nordic cooperation is actually needed.
Thank you for that, Mika.
If I can just add, I think what we also have observed in the Nordic context is that that tension doesn't just play out on the international and the multilateral level, but it also plays out within countries themselves. So especially in electricity, where in case of Finland, Finland is a single price zone, but then Norway and Sweden are not. And one of the consequences we have seen is that there are often quite different electricity prices between different regions in Sweden and Norway. So often electricity is produced up in the north, and the prices have been lower there, and then demand and use happens in the south. And one of the implications has been that building different interconnectors that would connect those regions more closely together and then even out those price differences consequentially have been quite controversial even on that national level. But a bit like on national level, as Mikael pointed out, part of the point is to create forums that facilitate open exchange of information and help to manage those tension points, not necessarily to ultimately resolve them.
Thank you. We will move on to the next question. That is Nathaniel Gilkey. Has Nordic policy adjusted to the reality that large energy infrastructure is a strategic target, or a government still focusing on market efficiency and climate targets? What is the political will across Nordic governments to pursue dispersed small modular reactors as a measure for strengthening long-term energy resilience? The nuclear.
Do you want to start, Mikael, or shall I go ahead?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So, kind of like the whole core observation of the report is that on one hand, yes, so there is alignment on the level of ministers, so ministerial declarations that do correctly identify these issues and threats, but then perhaps still work to be done on that more operational level, ensuring that the different national authorities are able to have a more ongoing, continuous discussion of sharing the relevant information, and of course, in some areas that relate to threats to physical infrastructure, that does also clash a bit with the kind of information sharing that can be also difficult, again, even on the national level between security authorities and then energy companies and national energy authorities. So there has been some difficulty in sharing that information on the national level, but even more so on that multilateral level. And that partially speaks to the gap in not yet fully institutionalizing information sharing, of establishing protocols for what can be shared on what timelines and what cannot. So there's a bit of an ad hoc element currently, and that speaks to the need to develop that institutional layer to ensure seamless exchange of information when these incidents and threats materialize, so that it is not an ad hoc process that may adapt or may not adapt based on the incident. On the second part, just on the SMRs, of course, this reflects longer term divergences within the Nordic region when it comes to nuclear power. So Finland and Sweden, with a bigger share of nuclear power in their electricity mixes, have also been the furthest down the road in exploring different SMR development options, while Denmark and Norway less so. But ultimately, what we try to put through the report is that in some ways the diversity in the energy systems is also Nordic region's strength. So the fact that we have quite diverse mixes where Norway and Sweden have those notable hydro reserves, while Finland has substantial nuclear power, and then different offshore and onshore wind energy mixes, reduces the likelihood of there being a single shock that cascades through the whole region simultaneously. So again, perhaps the point is not to advocate for a uniform approach to energy policy, nor SMRs specifically, but again, to ensure that there is alignment on what those national level policies then imply in this integrated Nordic system.
Thank you. Next question is from Claire. Specific emergency actions may require actors like TSOs to deploy large batteries at specific nodes. How do you think current regulations set in the CEP and other EU frameworks, notably clearly limiting storage assets, ownership/operation, may actually limit the type of responses to situations you discussed?
Well, I can. That's a very relevant point. The current EU framework is designed around market neutrality and generally seeks to limit TSO ownership of storage assets to avoid sort of crowding out of competitive market actors. So the question is whether those rules are fully suited to a security environment where storage may sometimes be needed as critical infrastructure rather than purely as a market asset. Our report does not take a position on specific regulatory reforms, but it does point to a broader challenge. Some of the assumptions underpinning energy market design were developed for a different security environment. That's what we've been sort of reiterating here. As resilience and preparedness becomes more important, there may be a need to revisit whether operators have sufficient tools to respond to exceptional circumstances and sort of system level security risk.
Thank you. That's a good question. We have a question from Rehman Hassan. How do we support or motivate the market end users to move for resilience in their planning, considering decisions are made based on cost benefits, as the costs may increase to improve resilience?
Well, that is really the central challenge of resilience policy. Market and companies will naturally optimize for efficiency and cost unless resilience is valued and rewarded or required. And in practice, these are the three approaches. First, regulation can set minimum resilience requirements. Second, market incentives can reward flexibility and redundancy and preparedness. And third, governments can share some of the costs where resilience creates broader societal benefits that individual actors cannot fully capture. And the key point is that resilience should not be seen as the opposite of competitiveness. Increasingly, resilience is becoming very much a precondition for competitiveness in this more uncertain and contested environment.
And just to add, I think one point is, of course, also what we recommend in the report is to explore that kind of a Nordic level emergency stockpile, especially for this electricity equipment that is increasingly critical to the energy system. So the different transformers and high voltage cables and these types of critical components, because often in case of these, the lead times can be several months. And of course, then that does pose a question that we do not quite go to that depth in the report, but there's a question of how to fund this. And if we're talking of ultimately private electricity infrastructure, should some kind of public-private cost sharing be embedded into the design of such possible systems to ensure that the resilience costs are not only on the public side, but this is perhaps not the level we have gone here yet. But the idea is that as these types of threats become more acute and the reliance on electricity as the primary form of energy, then it is of course important to ensure that we are prepared for these types of disruptions. And then perhaps the second avenue for Nordic alignment would be on embedding these types of resilience requirements also in procurement. So again, this is an area where Nordics can achieve much more if there's a shared approach of different national authorities embedding the same type of standards. It also creates more predictability for market participants when there are expectations that scale across the region rather than piecemeal national frameworks.
Thank you. A question from Jay Hunter Hill. What is the role of energy storage in this discussion, both as a way to reduce curtailment, support congestion issues, and support long-term energy security from an infrastructural distributed perspective?
Well, I mean, we have of course seen that energy storage, both grid scale batteries and other such technologies have really been scaling rapidly over the last couple of years and have really been the big story in global clean energy transition. And of course, we also see the scaling of these technologies increasingly in the Nordics. And perhaps there are a couple implications that should be highlighted. One is that they do add to the resiliency of the system. And we have seen this also very clearly in the case of Ukraine, where distributed energy system with distributed both production and that storage does add to the resiliency, since it's less dependent on individual big power plants and more dispersed. At the same time, it also increases exposure to some of these critical components, for which again, one solution would be to explore Nordic level pooling of strategically important components. Perhaps at this stage still, if we do not look at hydro reserves, which act as a major energy security buffer, not just for the Nordics, but also Europe more widely, but look at the now rapidly growing battery side of the equation, that is still something that plays relatively small role currently on the level of the overall system. But again, it is of course important for Nordic authorities to establish standardized approaches to these where possible. So again, definitely a topic that would be very relevant for any Nordic energy security strategy or these types of working groups addressing energy security and bringing the different actors together.
Okay, thank you. And now on to more strategic question from Linus Oman. Energy is an area where the civil and military needs and interests coincide. Traditionally, there has been watertight division between defense, like Nordefco, crisis management, like Haga, and the Nordic Council of Ministers. At the same time, you point out the need for actors to become more operational, more security-oriented, and more structured. How could the Nordic governments come together more effectively on this issue? I think this goes to something that you were talking about earlier, Mikael.
Yeah, I think the starting point is not necessarily creating new institutions, but creating better connections between the existing ones. Energy security today sits at very much at the intersection of civil preparedness and economic security and national defense. But many of the cooperation structures were built when those domains were treated very much separately. So one practical step would be to develop a shared Nordic energy security assessment that draws together perspectives from energy authorities, from civil preparedness agencies, from defense actors. A common threat picture is often the foundation for more effective coordination, and that's something that we point out here as well in the report, this need for a common threat picture. More broadly, then, the challenge is sort of moving from parallel cooperation tracks to a more integrated approach. Right? Critical energy infrastructure does not distinguish between civilian and military consequences, and increasingly our institutions need to reflect that reality as well.
Thank you. Following up on that, as all the Nordic countries, and this is a question from Svein Helgason, as all the Nordic states are a member of NATO, and you mentioned the role of NATO several times in the report, how important is it to complement and strengthen cooperation with NATO entities, providing valuable information to threat assessments and benefit from the work done alliance-wide and also by individual Nordic and Baltic allies?
Well, if I start, I think first important point is that, of course, this is where the Nordic landscape has really changed in the last five or so years. We're now going from a fragmented region when it comes to the security environment and the different institutionalization of it. Now we have, for the first time, Nordics under the same roof. And of course, NATO and the EU as the primary institutional anchors that different Nordic countries belong to means that Nordic cooperation, first of all, like on an overall level, should be additive to these existing frameworks rather than duplicating. And in case of NATO, of course, NATO adds a couple of benefits, but then it has its own drawbacks when it comes to energy security. So, of course, the benefit of NATO is that in that military context, there are protocols in place sharing information on these types of sensitive military threats and disruptions. But then the other side of that coin is that NATO also is not an energy security organization. So there are specific institutions under NATO that focus on energy security, but in a way it's small pieces of that bigger mandate that NATO has, which means that it lacks a bit of that operational detail and continuous exchange of information. And that's where the Nordic cooperation can build on. So taking those NATO approaches and protocols, but then ensure that there is that operational continuity in bringing that information and ways of exchanging that information outside of those military focused frameworks of NATO to then more continuous exchange of information between the different energy authorities and TSOs and major energy companies.
I can perhaps I think NATO has, of course, become an increasingly important part of the Nordic energy security landscape. Many of the risks we discuss in this report, whether critical infrastructure protection, hybrid threats, cyber threats, or situational awareness in general, are not purely energy issues. They are broader security issues with energy implications. The value of NATO is not that it necessarily replaces Nordic cooperation, but that it complements it. NATO brings intelligence and threat assessments, operational experience, and sort of this wider regional perspective that the individual countries or Nordic institutions cannot generate entirely on their own. So I see this as both and rather than either or. Stronger Nordic cooperation and closer engagement with NATO are mutually reinforcing. So the more integrated the threat picture, the better equipped governments will be to anticipate and respond to risks.
Thank you. Another question about the TSOs from Claire. What are your thoughts on the ownership of some of the TSOs in the EU? Many are owned by private, profit-oriented, sometimes non-European actors, and whether their strategic decisions might not be aligned with security priorities in the EU.
Well, I guess this is an area where there's a lot of European level diversions, but then perhaps a bit less so on the Nordic level. So there were these privatization waves in 1990s, especially across Europe, that put many TSOs under partial or even majority private ownership in some cases. But in the Nordic context, the state involvement and ownership is, of course, still quite high, and that does ensure some level of ability to embed these types of security considerations in their mandates. And in that view, I mean, the report doesn't itself really take a stance on what is the optimal ownership arrangement for TSOs, but really focuses on more how they work together ultimately.
It's ultimately a question of governance rather than ownership alone. The fact that some TSOs have private shareholders and does not automatically mean that their decisions are misaligned with public interests. And they operate within a highly regulated frameworks and are of course subject to national oversight. That said, as energy infrastructure becomes more strategically important, there is a legitimate question about whether existing governance arrangements are sufficient to ensure that long-term resilience and redundancy and the security of supply considerations that are needed. One of the broader themes of the report is precisely that security objectives need to be more systematically integrated into infrastructure planning. The key issue is ensuring that strategic and security priorities are sort of appropriately embedded in decision making, whatever the ownership structure may be.
So thank you. There's a question for us here about the next steps. I'll take that in the end, but two questions here. That's from Solgun Furnes. It could be argued that more cooperation in the energy system, joint development and information sharing potentially simultaneously creates new security issues. Have any thoughts on this and how to manage them? And I guess that goes straight to the energy trilemma that we heard about at the beginning here.
Yeah. I mean, of course, this is ultimately the big tension point in this type of integration, but ultimately a more integrated system, if properly managed, is also the more resilient one, as kind of highlighted from, if you look at, again, like electricity, just like the fact that we have these different ways of producing electricity that creates then resilience across the system. So if, for example, in case of Finland, we have had these episodes of low winds in the winter in a system that has high reliance on wind power, then one buffer against that has been the ability to import electricity from Norway and Sweden, from their hydro that is less weather exposed under those conditions. But then it also plays the other way around, where if there are disruptions to supply in other Nordic countries, then the Finnish or Swedish nuclear energy can act as a buffer against those disruptions. So perhaps this is partially a public communication challenge of how to communicate to the wider public the resilience benefits of integration, because often the story focuses more on the downside when prices go up in one price zone because of higher demand from elsewhere. And that's perhaps the story that dominates the discussion when it comes to building interconnectors, especially between the Nordic system and then the continental European system. But perhaps there's also these two tracks of integration. One is of Nordic regions integration with Europe, where perhaps there is that more politically difficult tension, where yes, Nordic integration with wider European system adds to the resilience of overall European energy system. But of course, in the context where Nordics have their act a bit more together and this diverse production mixes, it means that the prices do tend to go higher in Europe, and ultimately the beneficiaries are more on the continental side. But we don't really see this kind of dynamic within the Nordic system itself, where any country would be under-investing in its energy system. So perhaps in the Nordic context, making that case for integration, meaning also resilience in this regional system, I think should be in a way easier to make.
When you talk about that, that also brings to the second part of Solgun's question about public acceptance. Securing the public acceptance for identified measures and investments in the energy sector is a major issue, even when the benefits are mainly local or national. Do you have any thoughts on this aspect when the benefits are Nordic, which could seem even further away from the local interests? How do we balance this?
Well, there's a couple of points. I mean, one is that electrification is the big story of energy right now, both globally and then in the Nordics. And in the context of, if you compare electricity to fuels, like the traditional fossil fuel-based system, of course, one of the aspects is that when there are disruptions to fuel supply, then the way that it affects users has a bit of a buffer in terms of time, because there are emergency reserves in place, and cars have their tanks filled. While if there's a disruption to electricity systems, then those disruptions cascade across the systems instantly. And one of the implications is that there needs to be a buffer against these in terms of capacity to produce and flexible generation to step in, but then also these critical components, as more and more of the energy system is dominated by electricity, and having a reserve is probably cheaper to do it in a scaled way regionally, rather than every country building its own national reserve for critical components. So that's one. And then part of the story is that economic development investments and resilience investments also go hand in hand. As the system electrifies, future industries are increasingly reliant on electricity, and that also means that investments into the grids and the plants that serve future employment and industry also are investments that benefit resilience.
Thank you.
I think if I still may, I think the key is to frame these investments not primarily as acts of Nordic solidarity, because they aren't that, but they're investments in shared resilience. So the Nordic countries are so interconnected that the disruption in one country quickly affects others. So strengthening the resilience of the wider system ultimately also strengthens national resilience as well. And more broadly, I think public supports tend to be strongest when people understand both the risks of inaction and the concrete benefits of action. And making resilience visible before a crisis occurs is often, of course, harder than building it, but it's increasingly also an important task for policymakers, of course.
And I'll soon wrap up, Michael, but before we do that, and thank you for everyone who sent in questions, and you're also, of course, welcome to send us at Nordic Energy Research or Economic Security Forum questions after. But just to wrap up, to you, Michael, if you can give us one big learning you've done from Economic Security Forum doing this task for Nordic Council of Ministers, what would it be?
Well, Antti, you're welcome to fill in here, but I think our first recommendation in the report of a common energy security strategy, I think is very, very important, because it underpins a lot of the other recommendations here. So I think that's something we want to definitely lift up here, and it shouldn't be too difficult to implement actually. But Antti, if you wanna.
Or I think maybe looking into the Nordic Energy Cooperation, I think it has also lessons for Nordic cooperation more widely. I think Nordics have really set the record in European context for regional integration, but at the same time we have also maybe become to take it a bit for granted and not really invest into the operational layer and that institutional layer. So our heads of state or different ministers, of course, convene through the year multiple times, and there is that ongoing dialogue. But overall, perhaps the integration still remains a bit ad hoc when you scratch a bit deeper. And especially in the case of energy, we exist in such a deeply integrated system and in a ever more deeply integrating system that that gap between good high-level trust and dialogue on the higher political level, but then that slightly underdeveloped technical layer exposes gaps that can be consequential in the times of crisis, but then also makes the system perhaps a bit less efficient than it could be, both in the delivering economic development and well-being across the region.
Thank you for that. And I think with that, we will end today's launch event. I can answer one. I see there's a question in the chat about what are the next steps, and I can just answer that by reiterating our General Secretary Karen Ellemann's keynote this morning, which is saying that with this report we now have a foundation that we can move forward, and we have some good recommendations that have been mapped out by Economic Security Forum, and we will use them in our work to continue to strengthen the Nordic cooperation on energy security. So that's the short answer to that. But you're welcome to follow Nordic Energy Research's activities if you want to learn more about that. And then I might also say that this report is now online at NordPub, the Nordic Council of Ministers publication, and also at nordicenergy.org, where you are welcome to read the report. It's open access, so everyone can look into it. I think we'll keep it at that, and all other questions we can take by email or phone afterwards. And thank you everyone for joining today, and I hope you enjoy to read the report. Thank you to Antti Raula and Michael Miguel and to Karen Ellemann for opening today, and have a great week.
Thank you so much on our part as well. Thanks.